And thanks to you at home for joining us this hour. Lots of news to cover tonight. As we expected at this time last night, daybreak today brought absolutely terrible images of the destruction left behind by Hurricane Michael, particularly where it made landfall in Mexico Beach, Florida, and nearby Panama City. Today we have been following the news of that devastation, hospital evacuations in the Panhandle, the scary news about helicopters being used to airlift in pallets of food and water to a large-scale, secure psychiatric facility that wasn't evacuated ahead of the storm. So we'll have more on the storm damage ahead, including what appears to be pretty significant damage at Tyndall Air Force Base. That Air Force Base was evacuated, but the footage we're getting in today and tonight indicates that there may be some serious and very expensive damage at Tyndall Air Base, including, it looks like, to lots of aircraft at that base. The Dow Jones dropped over 500 points today after it lost over 800 points yesterday. This two-day sell-off may be a fluke. It may be about larger systemic concerns involving the president's elective trade war or the Fed or whatever. But for whatever reason, dropping 1,400 points in 2 days is enough to flip anyone's stomach. Today, the U.S. Senate made plans to go home and not come back until well after the midterms are over. Wow, must be nice. A third of the seats in the U.S. Senate are up this election. So lots of incumbent senators, of course, want to head home to campaign instead of being stuck in Washington doing all that dumb voting on stuff and all the other boring Senate stuff they don't really like. Still, though, the deal they reached to go home now until after the election seems like a really cheap deal for Republicans. As part of this deal, Democrats agreed that they would speed the approval of 15 male Trump-appointed federal judges, a new list of 15, in exchange for, that's what they're giving, the Democrats are giving, all right, we're going to speed through 15 male judges you want for lifetime appointments. Okay, you can get those. We get, in response, the right to go home now. That seems to be the whole deal. If something seems off to you about that, you're right. I mean, obviously, it hurts Democratic incumbents as much as it hurts Republican incumbents to not be able to, campaign at home. So nobody really knows why Democrats agreed to give up any semblance of a fight on 15 lifetime federal judge appointments in order just to be allowed to go home. But that's what they did. Why do you have to make a major unilateral concession to get something that the other side wants too? Right? If you'd said, no, we're not going to give you all those judges, the Republicans might have said, okay, we'll all stay here and none of us can go home and campaign. Or they might have said, now we really want to go home. Either way, Democrats wouldn't be any worse off when it comes to fighting with the Republicans right now. But hey, it's Senate Democrats, so it's not like anybody's disappointed because it's not like anyone expected anything better. Last night, we had a really big viewer response from a story we did quite towards the end of the show about what appears to be a big voter suppression effort that's underway in the state of Georgia. Georgia is the state where Democrat Stacey Abrams, on the right, is running for governor against the Republican Secretary of State, Brian Kemp. Now, as the sitting Secretary of State in Georgia, Brian Kemp is in charge of elections in that state. He has not stepped down from those responsibilities, even though he himself will be at the top of the ticket in November because he's the Republican Party's candidate for governor. So he's effectively supervising his own election. As we talked about last night, based on new reporting from the AP, Brian Kemp's office has put on hold, they basically put in limbo 53,000 applications for voter registrations in his state. So these are people who have tried to register to vote in this year's election in Georgia, but the Secretary of State's office is not letting them do it. These people have submitted their voter registration applications. Secretary of State is holding them and not letting them go through. Of the 53,000 applications that Brian Kemp's office is currently sitting on, the AP reports that nearly 70% of those applications are from African-American voters. The overall population in Georgia is like somewhere between 30 and 35% black. 70% of the applications he's blocking are from black voters. I wonder what all this is about. Since the AP first reported on this problem in Georgia, and this is a big problem, tens of thousands of registrations, There's been sort of a growing uproar, not just in that state, but around the country about it. Well, tonight, the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights has announced that they've filed a lawsuit against Brian Kemp over those registrations that he and his office are blocking ahead of his own gubernatorial election. Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights seems fairly confident in their prospects of beating Brian Kemp in this lawsuit. They say they have beaten him in the past on this same issue, and they expect to do so again. That confidence is interesting, and it may be true that they're going to beat him here, but, tick-tock. The election at this point is 26 days away. But here's another jaw-dropping story about the election. This one also just breaking over the last 24 hours. And this one ends with a bizarre arrest. We're going to hear from a moment in the person who was arrested at the end of this story. Here's where the story starts. 1971, voting age in this country changes from 21 to 18. And that meant, for one thing, that Americans who were getting sent off to go fight in Vietnam, they'd now be old enough to vote for or against the politicians who were sending them to fight, which seems just like a baseline morally correct thing to do. As a practical matter, though, that voting change from 21 to 18 meant that 11 million new voters were suddenly created in the United States all at once. At least 11 million young people were newly eligible to vote. And that's a very exciting prospect if you had faith in the electoral wisdom of young voters. But those 11 million new voters were also a very scary prospect to people who didn't like the way they thought young people would vote. We're almost 50 years on from that change in American law, and the dynamic is basically still exactly the same. I mean, this year in 2018, Republicans' best chance for holding on to Congress is if young people don't get out and vote. The polling data from this year that shows that most young people don't intend to vote in the elections in November, that literally is Republicans' best hope of holding on to control of Congress. And it's Democrats' worst fear. But back in 1971, when they first dropped the voting age from 21 to 18, so 18, 19, 20-year-olds could all vote, back then when they made the change, there was a bit of a national freakout, specifically over the prospect of college students voting as a block in the college towns where they lived and went to school. From Middlebury, Vermont to Lexington, Kentucky, from Mississippi to New Jersey, Texas, Pennsylvania, Michigan, all over the country, in college towns, there were lawsuits all of a sudden to try to stop students from voting in their college towns once the voting age went to 18. Happened everywhere. And almost everywhere those lawsuits were filed, they failed. Because the courts kept finding over and over again that if anybody over age 18 can vote in this country and vote where they live, well, that applies to college students, too. Just because college students live where they go to school, that doesn't change anything about their right to vote where they live. The courts were almost universally consistent on that point, that college students over the age of 18 have a constitutional right to register and vote from where they're living to go to school. But still, eventually, even though most of the lower courts all lined up, eventually those legal fights made it up to the Supreme Court. And that's because of a particularly brutal fight over this subject at a school called Prairie View A&M in Waller County, Texas. Prairie View is sort of just northwest of Houston. It's between Houston and Austin as the crow flies. Prairie View A&M is a historically black college in a county, Waller County, Texas, that's not so black. Right now, Waller County, Texas, the overall population of the county is about 70% white, but the student body population at Prairie View A&M is 82% black. And in 1972, the year after the voting age changed from 21 to 18, lots and lots of students at Prairie View decided that they wanted to register and vote for the 1972 election. It was a super hot election, right? Nixon's running for re-election, running against a liberal anti-war candidate, George McGovern. Prairie View students, 18, 19, 20-year-olds, they've newly got the right to vote. They decide, like students all around the country, that they wanted to register and vote, and they decided that in large numbers. County officials in Waller County, Texas, though, decided they were not going to allow that. They did not want these Prairie View students voting, not in their county. Top elections official in the county dug in personally and decided he would make it his life's mission to block those students from voting in his county. He had his own ideas about what constituted a real Waller County resident for the purposes of voting. And students at that black school did not fit that idea that he had. And so he invented all sorts of tests that had the effect of not letting students at that local college register to vote in Waller County. That turned into a legal fight that wound its way through the courts. Ultimately, by 1979, that fight got to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled unequivocally in the students' favor. Just like all those lower courts had said, too. You can vote where you live, even if the reason you're living there is because you're going to college there. It is an unequivocal principle affirmed by the Supreme Court, thanks to those students at Prairie View A&M in Texas who wouldn't give up. But Waller County, Texas, it turns out, they wouldn't give up either. They wouldn't give up trying to shut down those students from voting. Not in their county. Are you kidding? Have you seen those students? Right? Even after that Supreme Court ruling in 1979, Waller County kept going after those students at that local college over and over and over again. In 1992, so more than a decade after the Supreme Court had ruled in the students' favor, in 1992, more than a dozen students from Prairie View A&M got indicted, got criminally charged for illegally voting. Originally, it was reported that 14 students were indicted. Ultimately, it was actually 19 students who got indicted. They were indicted for illegally voting. They were not illegally voting. They were voting from their residential address, which was the school, the college at which they resided. But the county just decided, you know what, that looks illegal to us. 19 students indicted. It's clearly an effort to keep students at that school from voting in the 1992 election. Ultimately, the Department of Justice sent a nasty letter to county officials. Amid that pressure from Washington, amid the uproar over the students being indicted, see that photo there, quoting Public Enemy, right? Remember, it was 1992. Ultimately, after the uproar, all those indictments did get dismissed, but Waller County wasn't done. In 2003, the county DA published a letter in the county newspaper declaring that no matter what the law said, no matter what the court said, he still considered it to be illegal for students at Prairie View to vote. He personally pledged in the local paper that he would indict any students who voted for criminal voter fraud. That was 2003. 2006, in the elections that year, hundreds of Prairie View students had their votes challenged. Again, on the basis of the fact that those students had committed the grievous voting crime of trying to vote while being students at a historically black college in a mostly white county. In 2008, the county decided that despite the thousands of students at the college, despite the thousands of registered voters among the students at the college, the county decided in its wisdom that they would set up a super convenient polling place for those students that was just about 30 miles from campus. This county in Texas, Waller County in Texas, I mean, Supreme Court or no, they have just absolutely dug in. They will do anything they can to make it as hard as possible for these black students to vote. They'll do anything they can. It wasn't until 2013, almost 40 years after that Supreme Court ruling in the students' favor, that the students ever got their first polling location that was actually on campus. Unless you think that means that the fight there is at least now over, no, it's not, because now it's 2018, and so now the county has a new plan. This is from Houston Station, local Houston station, KHOU.
Nearly 10,000 students attend Prairie View A&M University, so we're talking a lot of potential votes. Turns out 2 addresses Prairie View A&M students were told to use on registration forms are in different precincts, meaning that on Election Day, a large number of students might not be able to vote on campus, or they'd possibly be turned away. Trey Duhan is county judge and tells me the Waller County Elections Office is working with Prairie View A&M to remedy address issues.
We understand that Waller County's had a history, but we have worked very hard to make sure the students have their right to vote. I want all the students at Prairie View to know there is nothing that's going to be done that's going to deprive them of their ability to vote if they've registered for this election.
If they've registered for this election. If they've registered. But are they registered? Are they properly registered? You saw the bit in that news footage about the 2 addresses that Prairie View students were told to use on their voter registration forms. That was at the direction of the county. What the county told students at Prairie View was that if they want to register to vote, they should register to vote using 2 school addresses that the county gave them. The county told them to use those addresses on their registration forms. Now the county says, actually, no, maybe one of those addresses is wrong. Hope you didn't register using that one. The deadline to register to vote for next month's elections in Texas was this week. It was Tuesday. So yesterday, Wednesday, the day after the deadline, the campaign for the Democratic congressional candidate in that district, Matt Siegel, a Democrat who's running against Republican incumbent Congressman Michael McCaul, he sent his field director to Waller County Courthouse to deliver a letter, to deliver this letter. It's a letter that's basically trying to protect the vote of the students at Prairie View. It's a letter from local Democrats, including the field director's candidate, Mr. Siegel. And it demands that since these students registered to vote using the address the county gave them and told them to put on their forms, the county shouldn't now block these kids from voting or try to send them somewhere else or field them out to some other precinct that they don't know where it is or make them fill out additional documentation like they've done something wrong. What these kids did was follow the county's directions for how to register. They didn't do anything wrong. If the county screwed it up, they shouldn't put it on these kids and make it harder for them to vote or block those kids for voting in order to deal with their own mistake. So that's the letter. Candidate Mike Siegel sends his field director down to the county seat, down to the county courthouse to personally deliver this letter. Time is of the essence, right? The voter registration deadline was on Tuesday. He sends his field director down to the courthouse the day after the voter registration deadline, yesterday. Field director delivers the letter to a clerk at the courthouse. Field director then apparently snaps a picture of the fact that he has delivered the letter to the clerk at the courthouse to verify that the letter has been delivered. Then they arrested him. They asked him what party the candidate was whose campaign he worked for, and then they arrested him. And yes, it's as weird as it sounds. This is from the Houston Chronicle's write-up of what happened here. Quote, a field director for Democratic congressional candidate Mike Siegel was arrested at the Waller County Courthouse yesterday after he delivered a letter demanding the county update the status of students at a nearby college whose registrations were thrown into question the day before. The bailiff stopped the campaign field director as he was trying to exit the building and then apparently called the police. The field director then called the candidate he works for, who's an attorney. The candidate, Mike Siegel, said on the phone with his field director, he heard his field director being repeatedly asking why he was being held by police and whether he was free to go. At one point, the field director told a detaining officer that the lawyer he was on the phone with during this conversation was a candidate who was running for Congress. According to the candidate and his field director, the officer then asked, quote, what party is he from? Shortly after, the field director told him that his candidate was a Democrat, the young field director was arrested. He was told, apparently, that he was being arrested for a 48-hour investigative detention. There were initial reports that he was arrested for not producing identification to a law enforcement officer. We've seen other reports that said he was arrested for suspicious behavior in a courthouse. A sheriff's captain told that to Josh Marshall, the editor at Talking Points Memo today. But in any case, they arrested him. The guy's out now, but here's like the favorite little grace note for me in this whole story. After they arrested the congressional candidate's field director, reportedly after confirming with him that he worked for a Democratic campaign specifically, after they arrested him and they held him and then they finally let him out, even after they finally let him out, they kept his phone. He is the field director for the Democratic congressional candidate in that district, and the election is less than a month away. Now local law enforcement has confiscated his phone for the crime of handing over a letter trying to make sure that local students at the local black college can vote this time. Happy 2018. I know it feels like your TV set should be in black and white as I'm telling this story, but no, this is us now. Joining us now is Mike Siegel, Democratic congressional candidate, and his field director, Jacob Aronowitz, who was arrested yesterday. Mr. Siegel, Mr. Aronowitz, thank you very much for being with us tonight. I appreciate you both making the time.
Thank you so much, Rachel. We're really glad for this opportunity. Thank you, Rachel.
Jacob, I know I'm going to say this as both a thank you and a caveat. I have been advised that you have been awake for well over 24 hours and that you're in a little bit of physical distress at this point because of what you have been through. I want to thank you for making time given those circumstances and just ask you what you have been through over the last day or so. What actually have you been through?
Well, your recounting of events was accurate. I was arrested and held at the Waller County Sheriff's Jail, and the phone was taken, was confiscated, and at the time of its confiscation, they said they were going to seek a warrant to go through its contents, and that didn't happen. And I did get the phone back earlier today, but the experience was harrowing, and well, it made me reflect on what people in that county deal with on a day-to-day, year-to-year basis.
Mr. Siegel, I understand from reporting both in the Houston Chronicle and from Josh Marshall at Talking Points Memo that you apparently were on the phone with Jacob while he was being detained and basically up until the point where he was arrested, essentially conferring with him and trying to advise him through this process. What was that like for you?
At first, I thought it was a joke, that they were just going to ask him a couple questions and let him go. But as it continued further and further and more law enforcement officials arrived, I think by the end, Jacob was surrounded by 7 or more deputies and police officers. I realized that, we are in a different place. I'm lucky enough to live in Austin, Texas, and we don't face this kind of repression on a day-to-day basis. But the idea that a simple taking of a picture of delivering a letter would end up being kept in custody for 2 hours, and they put their hands on Jacob, they wouldn't let him go, they threatened to hold him for multiple days. I was horrified that they would do this to someone for the simple act of delivering a letter.
And what's the status of the students who were the subject of that letter? I ran through a little bit of the history of Prairie View A&M. Honestly, I could do a week-long series about that history because it is such an important thing in American civil rights, and what those students have been up against, what they've fought for, what they continue to have to fight for is a heck of a saga in American voting rights and civil rights. But Mike, what's the status right now in terms of whether or not these potentially thousands of voters at Prairie View A&M are going to be able to cast their votes without any hassle on Election Day?
Well, we're hopeful that through shining a light on this issue, that we can achieve the objective of having all the students' voting status restored and taking away this impediment where they're being asked to fill out additional papers, which will, of course, lengthen the wait for voting and would discourage some students from voting. But I'm just really thankful that I'm able to use my campaign to shine light on this issue, this historic issue that you've outlined. I mean, there are so many women of color, African-American leaders in that community who have been fighting for voting rights for decades. And so the fact that we can use this campaign to shine a light on what's happening in Waller County gives me a little bit of encouragement. I think big picture, we're going to have to continue to negotiate with Waller County, with the county judge, to get them to reverse their decision. One thing you didn't note, Rachel, was that they just announced this decision 2 weeks before the close of voter registration. So on September 26th is when they announced at a meeting that they were going to change the way they perceived the voting status of the students. And so really this is this very late change to the voting status, and it's something that would not be allowed under the previous version of the Voting Rights Act. Texas used to be in pre-clearance, and this is something that, because it's an impediment to voting, wouldn't have been allowed but for that recent Supreme Court decision that invalidated part of the Voting Rights Act.
Right. Specifically, Waller County used to have to prove to the Justice Department that if they were making any change in their policies or practices around election, they'd have to prove that it wasn't either intended to or going to have the effect of racial discrimination. Now, since the conservative majority on the Supreme Court killed the Voting Rights Act, gutted that part of it, they no longer have to make that proof. I'll ask you just one last question before you go, and this is actually for Jacob. Jacob, there's been reporting that you, before you were arrested, you were specifically asked whether the candidate or what party the candidate was whose campaign you were working for. I just want to confirm with you whether or not that actually happened. I think that struck a lot of people around the country as a sort of a shocking part of this, that you were asked what party Mr. Siegel was before you were arrested. Is that true?
Yeah, that is accurate. And Mr. Siegel, Mike was on the phone, on speakerphone, and he heard the question asked as well. And honestly, that might have been one of the most chilling parts of the entire encounter, because there's like, I mean, it's pretty clear where someone's coming from when they ask you a question like that.
Yeah, especially when they follow it up by arresting you.
Exactly. It was a very, very chilling question, and as I said, Mike heard it too, so I can definitely confirm that.
Democratic congressional candidate Mike Siegel is running against Michael McCaul, Republican incumbent in Texas. Campaign field director Jacob Baranowitz. Jacob, I hope you get some sleep. Thanks for making time, both of us, to talk us through this. Much appreciated.
Thank you,
Anytime.
Rachel. Appreciate it.
Much more ahead tonight. Do stay with us.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.